This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
So last week I kicked off this exploration of what is nirvana and do we really want to get there? And I talked about how, usually when in these sort of class situations, we're either explaining what the Dharma is, what the Dharma says, or we're giving practical guidance about how to apply that in our lives. And what we're trying to do on this course is something a bit different to that. We're trying to get underneath all of that and explore our ideas and assumptions about what the Dharma actually is, what the path is and where it goes, what practice is and where it takes us. So we're trying to sort of get underneath, and today in the talk I'll talk a little bit more about that metaphor of getting underneath. And last week I was talking about that in the context of Buddhism coming to the West. So I said, in a way, we're very, very early Buddhists in the context of Buddhism coming to the West. It's very, very early days. And I talked about the possible dangers and opportunities of this transition, Buddhism coming into a completely new world, a completely new culture, a completely new sort of worldview, as it were. In a way, maybe there are opportunities in that. You can sort of cut back the dead wood. You can cut back what's become a bit kind of literalized and a bit stuck. You can cut all that back and you can allow things to re-express and to grow in a new way. There can be new life and new expression of the Dharma. Maybe that can be a really creative, good thing. And then perhaps at the same time, there's certain dangers. And we explored what that might mean last week, that the Dharma just gets somehow over-accommodated or diluted by certain ideas and assumptions that are in the culture that it's coming into. So maybe you end up with something which is, certain ideas and practices are taken on, but in a bit of a kind of selective kind of way. And you end up with something which may be very, very benign, very, very helpful for living a good human life, but somehow it doesn't really fully open up the deep perspective of Buddhism, the deep perspective of awakening and enlightenment, or it somehow subtly maybe kind of limits that, as it were. Or maybe even you get something that comes in and it seems helpful and humane, but actually it's taken on in a way which even just perpetuates a kind of self-preoccupation, a certain kind of narcissistic self-preoccupation that we have in our culture, as it were. So those were the sorts of questions I was posing last week and asking, what really is Buddhism? In the way that Buddhism is coming to the West, are we really absolutely fully taking on what the Buddha taught? Or are we sort of doing it in a selective way which downplays certain things? And when I was talking like this, I wasn't actually thinking so much of Triratna. I'm thinking of the whole Western Buddhist scene and, the whole scene around that, of spirituality, which is in some way informed and inspired by Buddhism. Do certain things get emphasized and brought to the fore, and certain other aspects get left behind or put in the background more and more. So where I want to start today is to just explore a bit more the power of ideas. Power of ideas. Apparently the word idea comes from the Greek ideon. I don't quite know how you pronounce it, but it's a word that means to see. So that's the root of the word idea, it's to see. And I was reading recently about there are some rare cases of people that are born blind. They're born blind, and then later in life, either through some medical advance or through some sort of miracle that happens, their eyes start functioning again. And apparently what happens is they can't straight away see. Yeah, actually, it can be quite disorientating, even upsetting at first. What happens? There are colours, there are shapes, there are lights. There's things happening, but it's terribly confusing. They don't know what any of it means. Yeah, they actually have to learn to see. Yeah, there's just all this stuff going on, but they have no idea what it is, how to interpret it, what it actually means. Yeah, there's a whole kind of conceptual, perceptual framework and system that they have to learn in order to sort of turn all of that into seeing things, into being able to sort of understand and interpret their experience in any kind of meaningful way. Yeah. So if you think about that, it's very profound. Yeah. It's showing the role of the mind. It's showing that we don't actually see what our eyes see. We see what our mind sees. Yeah. In a way, this is almost the central Buddhist insight. It's there in the first lines of the Dhammapada, isn't it? Our lives are shaped by our mind. We become what we think. Yeah. Our mind is profoundly shaping and interpreting and making our experience all the time. Yeah. And yes, it's according to certain ideas, certain sort of frameworks, certain models of interpretation, yeah, that are very, very deep and embedded and subtle. So all of us, all the time, we're in the grip of ideas. We're in the grip of ideas, whether we know it or not. Yeah. There was a time in my life, in my Buddhist life, where I had a lot of doubt. And I realised I was very strongly affected by the materialistic assumptions and views in the culture around me. I just couldn't sort of shake them off. Just the idea that, we're just made of matter and consciousness is just a sort of accidental byproduct of matter and none of it has any kind of real meaning or significance. I realised I was deeply affected by these ideas. They were just sort of in me, part of me. I'd kind of grown up with them and I couldn't kind of shake them off, even though I had sort of all sorts of other ideas and experiences as well. And it sort of led me to reflect, where do these ideas come from? It wasn't as if at school my physics teacher stood up in front of the class and said, "Hey kids, look, I want you to know everything's just made of matter and consciousness is just a byproduct of matter and it's not real, really." It wasn't like that. I was never sort of explicitly taught anything like that. And yet it was in me, yeah. And those ideas didn't come from my experience either. Yeah, actually, I've had certain experiences which would seem to kind of indicate other things are possible or other things are true. But I tended to sort of downplay those experiences because of these sort of deep assumptions that I had. Yeah, we're just in a certain worldview that has certain ideas, and because we're in it, it's very hard to see it. It just seems true and self-evident and like it's completely real. And we can forget that things like matter, the idea that everything is made up of matter, it's just an idea. Yeah, I mean, there's kind of real experiences we have, but to say that's matter is just putting a certain label. It's just putting a certain kind of conceptual apparatus on that real experience that we have. Yeah, that's what we're doing when we talk like that. But it's very, very easy to forget that's what we're doing because we're in the grip of ideas. Yeah, and these ideas have huge significance. So I'm talking now about very deep ideas about what is real and what is not real. How do we know what's real and what's not real? Yeah, and these ideas sort of build up into a whole worldview, a whole myth, if you like, or a whole cosmology, a whole idea of who we are, what it means to be alive, what our place in the universe is, what the universe means, and so on. These ideas are hugely significant, and they have a long, long history. There are ideas in us that have been playing out over centuries through history. So to give an example of what I mean, in the West, historically, it was monotheistic. There was a belief in a God who created the universe and created us, and we have one life. We have one life, and then we die, and we either go to heaven or to hell. So there's one short life, and then eternal salvation or eternal damnation. And then as Western history proceeded, that gradually got replaced, or, to quite some extent has been replaced by an idea that, yes, we have one life. So the scientific materialistic view is there's one life and then we die and that's it. Then there's an eternity of nothing. Yeah. So, religion and science often get contrasted, but in there's actually kind of an interesting parallel there, isn't there? Yeah. Just this one life, and it has a kind of, that's it. Yeah. Everything is loaded onto that one life, that one short span of life. And that's it. In the East, they have a very different view, of course. So it's a kind of a view of rebirth or reincarnation. There are many lives. There's a whole kind of cycle of life and death and so on. And I remember Sangharakshita commenting that he noticed, whereas in the East they just sort of take that for granted, and in a way the point is to get off the wheel of life and not be reborn. In the West, people sometimes found the idea of rebirth very attractive. Yeah, they were attracted to it because it was a positive alternative to what was embedded in them of the idea of just one life and then you die and that's it. It kind of gave the possibility of something more. Yeah? So it actually seemed positive and attractive. And he also sort of noticed or speculated that it led us to sort of having a different relationship to our Dharma life, to our spiritual life. That, again, Westerners could be terribly willful and driven because there's just this one chance and you've got to get it right this time. Yeah. Whereas in the East, there's just this much, much bigger picture of many lives, and you just try and live a good life, but there'll be other opportunities, there'll be other possibilities. Yeah. It kind of takes the pressure off. It kind of eases things and gives a much kind of vaster perspective in a certain kind of way. Yeah. So you could say that, you could argue, and people do argue this, that there are these deep ideas that then take the shape of a whole kind of myth and religion and cosmology that then create a particular kind of psyche. Maybe in the West, one that's quite anxious, quite driven, where everything is loaded onto this one life. Yeah. There's certain kind of beliefs about our existential situation which create a certain style of consciousness, a particular kind of psychic pattern, yeah, of anxiety and drivenness, as it were. And some people have even linked this to the development of our modern world, our modern capitalist scientific world. Yeah. So this is a question that's interested historians for a long time. Why did what we now take as our modern world, capitalism and science and industry and technology and all of that, why did that develop in Europe and not somewhere else in the world? Particularly, why didn't it develop in China? China was a very, very advanced civilization long before Europe really kind of took off. So, for example, I don't know if you've read that book Sapiens by Yuval Harari. In there, there's a little illustration, actually. There's a little drawing of the boat that Christopher Columbus sailed in to go to America. And then next to it, there's a drawing of the kind of ships that the Chinese were sailing at the same time. Yeah. And Christopher Columbus's boat is like a rowing boat next to an ocean liner. The Chinese had these enormous ships with crews of hundreds and hundreds of people, and they sailed all over the world. Yeah. But they just went places. They had a look round, they maybe collected a few things, and then they went home again. Yeah. They didn't sort of set up colonies. They didn't conquer the world in the way that the Europeans did. Max Weber, the sociologist, he coined the term Protestant work ethic. Yeah. So again, there's an idea that there was a certain worldview, a certain religious sensibility, which created a certain style of consciousness, very kind of driven, very kind of hard-working, having to kind of achieve things. And he quite explicitly links that with, that was one of the particular conditions which led to, the development of science and industry and capitalism in Europe. Yeah, it had a kind of religious root. It had its root in certain ideas, certain very, very fundamental ideas, which create a certain kind of psychic being, psychic shape, which kind of drives history in a certain kind of way. So I'm glossing over some quite complex arguments here in a very quick, simplistic way, really just to make a point that we are profoundly shaped by ideas. Yeah, ideas create us. Ideas create who we are and what we become. And ideas create our world and our history. Yeah. We're made of ideas. Our world is made of ideas, of particular ways of looking and interpreting and understanding our experience. Yeah. Again, apparently the Greek word idea meant to model or to form or to shape. Yeah. So ideas are particular ways of looking and interpreting that model and form and shape both us and the world that we live in. And absolutely profoundly, deeply. And it's going on through history, over centuries, as it were. So then this raises very, very big, profound questions. So what ideas, what worldviews, what cosmologies are more likely to give rise to enlightenment, to awakening, to make that possible? What ideas and worldviews and myths and cosmology are more likely to conduce to really opening up the full possibility, the full potential of consciousness? Yeah. And what ideas and views and cosmologies might not, might actually close that down or make it less possible? What kind of world creates, might help us, point us in the direction of nirvana? What actually just perpetuates samsara, as it were, to put the question in a slightly different way? So recently I read a book by Evan Thompson. The book's called Why I'm Not a Buddhist. So Evan Thompson's a philosopher and he's studied Buddhism a lot over many years, and he has a very deep respect for Buddhism. But he's written this book saying why I'm not a Buddhist. And the reason is that he's disappointed with what he calls Buddhist modernism. He's disappointed in the various ways that Buddhism has been taken on in the West. So the kind of things that I was talking about last week, the kind of the way people have explored Buddhism and neuroscience, those sorts of things, that Buddhism is being adopted in a particular kind of way. And he's sort of disappointed by that and feels that it actually misses what's really radical and fundamental and distinctive about the Buddhist tradition. And he feels it's just actually playing into the kind of narcissism of Western culture. He has been critiqued a bit, so people have said, look, Buddhist modernism is a big thing, and he's kind of lumped it all together in one thing. But nevertheless, that's his argument. He's saying that as the Dharma has come into the West, it's got too much assimilated into the underlying assumptions and ideas of our modernist culture. And he poses a question right at the end of the book, actually. I think this might even be the last sentence of the book. He says, the question I would pose to Buddhists is whether they can find other ways to be modern besides being Buddhist modernists or traditionalists. The question I'd pose to Buddhists is whether they can find other ways to be modern besides being Buddhist modernists or fundamentalists. Yeah. So he can't quite be a traditional Buddhist because that's not his culture, but he doesn't want to be a Buddhist modernist either because he thinks that's not really fully Buddhist. Yeah, it's got sort of over assimilated in a certain kind of way. He wants to find another way of being Buddhist besides being a Buddhist modernist or a fundamentalist. So when I read that, I wondered to myself, had he ever come across the work of Sangharakshita? Had he ever come across Triratna and the Triratna Buddhist community? Because almost you could take that as a definition of what Triratna is about, I would say. That's one way you could put it, that what we're trying to do is to find a way to be Buddhist that is not being a Buddhist modernist and not being fundamentalist. So just to explore a little bit the breadth and depth of Sangharakshita's thought. When he was young, he went to India and he was exploring Buddhism and was ordained as a Buddhist monk. And he ended up living for many years in India. And in his 20s, he wrote The Survey of Buddhism, which is kind of his seminal book, Survey of Buddhism. It's very, very passionate, very, very, communicates great faith in the Buddhist tradition. And he's living, so he's writing it in India. He's living in a traditional society. And he very much takes on the whole of the Buddhist tradition. He's just immersing himself in the whole tradition, the whole kind of world of Buddhism. And you can see that he has a real faith in that and a real appreciation also of just being in a traditional culture, a traditional society. Yeah. His approach to Buddhist myth, to Buddhist cosmology in that book is very, very traditional. He just sort of accepts it and really embraces it, as it were. Later on in the late 60s, he comes back to the West. He comes back to a very, very different world, and a world that had changed a lot since he left it. The 60s revolution, everything that was going on in society. So he had to speak to a new time, to a new audience. He had to meet new people and sort of try and meet their experience and their worldview and communicate the Dharma, well, yes, to some extent, in their terms. So more and more starts to come out Sangharakshita, the radical, the reformer, the teacher who re-expresses the Dharma in a modern idiom. So, there were teachings such as mind, reactive and creative, the teaching of individuality, trying to give, the teaching of the love mode and the power mode, awareness and integration, all these ways of trying to re-express the Dharma in a way that modern people were going to be able to relate to. And he still used Buddhist myth and mythology, but he maybe gave it more of a psychological interpretation. He gave people a psychological way into it. So, for example, he would talk about the 6 realms of the Wheel of Life, but he would interpret it in a more psychological way. At the same time, he carried on being a traditionalist. And maybe actually as he got older, this started to come back out a bit more. Yeah, he always believed in rebirth and taught that you needed to take that teaching seriously. You know, he didn't insist people believed in it, but he said you must take it seriously and you need to think about it and you need to think about the implications of not believing it. And he always said himself that he took that on faith, as it were. He was although he had this very radical side, he also always had this very faithful sort of traditionalist side to him as well. He was very, very almost cautious and reluctant how he re-expressed things. He was quite willing to do it and was very bold. He's quite an interesting kind of combination of qualities, this radicalism and boldness, but also this very, very careful, cautious, respectful of the tradition. Yeah, interesting, very, very interesting combination of qualities here. Yeah. So another book I read recently is by a guy called Robert Ellis. He's actually an ex-Order member. And the book's called The Thought of Sangharakshita, A Critical Assessment. Probably the first book sort of trying to assess Sangharakshita's thought as a whole that's been written since he's died. And one of the main themes in the book is he's constantly contrasting Sangharakshita the radical and the reformer and the re-expresser with Sangharakshita the traditionalist. And he sees the two as in contradiction to each other. So he's constantly sort of showing the two and sort of showing how they contradict and saying, you know, this is contradictory, this is ridiculous. And he's in favour of the reformer and, you know, much more critical of the traditionalist, as it were. But I think I'd put it differently. I'd say the two are in tension, but they're not contradictory. It's just reflective of our historical situation, that we're trying to work out what it means to be Buddhist between two worlds. Yeah? That Buddhism is in this process of translation, this process of transition. We're between two worlds, and he's trying to kind of bridge those two worlds. Yeah, he's trying to kind of stay true to that situation that we're in, between two worlds, as it were. And he really sees value in the traditional worldview of Buddhism. He sees its value. He sees what that opens up, what that perspective can open up, the power of those ideas and those myths. He sees value in that, and he really doesn't want to lose that. Yeah? And at the same time, he knows that, well, yes, we also have to live in the modern world. There's certain things about the modern world which we have to kind of come to terms with and accept and live with. Yeah. So yes, I kind of link that Sangharakshita, the traditionalist, and the radical reformer, back to this quote from Evan Thompson, that he wants to find a way to be a Buddhist that's not being a Buddhist modernist or a fundamentalist. So I'm going to contrast two possible approaches. So first possible approach is that we bring Buddhist ideas, Buddhist values, Buddhist practices into our world. Yeah? So you could call this adapting Buddhism to the West. So that's what those secular approaches do. Yeah, we choose certain ideas and certain practices, and we find a way to apply them, which, you know, can be really, really helpful and really, really beneficial for certain people in certain situations. Yeah, we're just adopting and adapting in a certain kind of way. Another approach is the approach taken by Stephen Batchelor. So he's a very well-known Buddhist writer and commentator. One of his most important books is called After Buddhism. After Buddhism, Rethinking the Dharma for a Secular Age. And in that book, he contrasts secularization, so taking a certain practice like mindfulness and applying it not in the context of the whole of Buddhism. He says, in a way, that's not what he's trying to do. he wants to try and imagine a secular Buddhism. Yeah? So he wants to try and imagine just accepting our secular world, the scientific worldview and all of that, but really infusing it with Dharmic values. Yeah. And for him, he says that's adequate. He thinks we can do that, and it gives a perfectly adequate way of living, a perfectly adequate view of life, as it were. So he says, well, I can't accept something like rebirth, but I can accept the view of science that everything is interconnected and has effects going on. And for me, if I think of my life and death in that scientific concept, it kind of gives me enough of a sense of something beyond myself to live a really fully human life, as it were. Yeah. So, this is a very intelligent and I think thought-provoking argument that in a way deserves to be taken seriously. But other people have been critical of it. And, one of the criticisms of Batchelor is that he's very selective. He's choosing to take on certain things and not accept certain other things. Well, how do you choose? By what criterion do you make that choice? Yeah. And if you're making it by the criterion of the society and the culture that you're in, isn't there a danger of just losing something or missing something that's really significant or really important? Yeah. So you end up with something that's got a certain kind of shape, which is, yes, just a bit kind of slanted. So, for example, in his book, Batchelor tells stories about the Buddha. He quotes from the Pali Canon and sort of gives you a picture of the Buddha. And I read one review of his book where they slightly cheekily said, after a while, Batchelor's Buddha starts to remind you of somebody. Yeah. And who it starts to remind you of is Batchelor himself. It's a bit like an enlightened Stephen Batchelor. The Buddha comes across as very rational, very reasonable, very sceptical, very agnostic. Yeah. And the point is, it's a very, very selective, it's a very, very particular picture that he's ended up with. Yeah. And of course, we all do this to some extent. We all probably have a picture of the Buddha which is slanted by our own temperament and our own ideals and wishes and so on. But yeah, the point is maybe we need to be really careful around that and make sure we're not sort of limiting something and closing it down and in danger of missing something really vital. Yeah. On the other hand, maybe this approach of bringing ideas and practices into the West, perhaps that's where it has to start from. Perhaps that does build a bridge. It gives people a way in. It is perhaps it is a necessary part of the process of translation of Buddhism and the West meeting, as it were. So that's one broad approach, bringing Buddhist ideas and values and practices into the West, into our world, yeah, adapting Buddhism to the West. The other approach is to put ourselves into the worldview and the mythology and cosmology of Buddhism. Yeah. So adapting the West to Buddhism rather than adapting Buddhism to the West. Yeah. So putting ourselves into the worldview, the mythology and cosmology of the Buddhist tradition. Adapting ourselves, as it were, to Buddhism and seeing what that's like, seeing what happens when we take those sorts of perspective. So another book by Stephen Batchelor is called Buddhism Without Beliefs. It became a bestseller, actually. Buddhism Without Beliefs, and he presents his secularized, agnostic, rationalistic kind of take on Buddhism in that book. And a few years later, another Buddhist writer called David Brazier, he wrote a book called Buddhism is a Religion, You Can Believe It. Buddhism is a religion, you can believe it. So obviously quite a polemical title, and obviously, having it was a riposte to Batchelor. He was replying to Stephen Batchelor's idea of Buddhism, and he's saying no, Buddhism is a religion, you can believe it. Yeah. And he didn't mean belief in a dogmatic or literalistic or fundamentalist kind of way. He's saying that you can take things on faith. It's okay to take things on faith, that this life is a mystery. There are certain things that we can't know rationally. And it's okay just to kind of give ourselves to the Buddhist tradition and take things on faith. Yeah? And maybe these days to take something on faith is seen as somehow simple and unsophisticated. But I suppose he's arguing against that and saying, no, that's what religion is. It's a vision, it's an ideal which we just give ourselves to in that kind of way. So, for example, with rebirth, personally, I just take it on faith. The Buddha taught rebirth. I've discovered so much truth in what the Buddha has taught. It's sort of unfolded so much for me. I've never come across anything that seems unhelpful or untrue. So I just take, and the Buddha taught rebirth, so I just take that on faith. Yeah, I believe in it. Yeah, I know that I don't know for sure. I'm quite aware that I can't prove it, and that in a way death is a mystery and an unknown by definition, really. But I take it on faith. I take it as a perspective that I just put myself into and see what opens up from that. Yeah. Because I also know that you can't prove the materialistic view. Yeah, that raises all sorts of questions about what consciousness is. That doesn't explain anything either, really. Yeah. The Buddha's advice to the Kalamas was, they wanted to know what you believe and what you don't believe, and he said you have to go by your own experience, and you have to go by the testimony of the wise. Yeah. So with something like rebirth, obviously our experience is limited. We can't know from our experience. Yeah. So for me, I go by the testimony of the wise, the fact that Buddhism through centuries has taught this. Yes, one can take that seriously in a certain kind of way and take it on faith. So just a few last thoughts by way of drawing to a conclusion for today. So I've been talking about the power of ideas, and particularly these deep, deep ideas and worldviews that are in us. They're kind of deep in us through our history. Ideas about what's real and what's not real, ideas about what life means and so on. Yeah, and these ideas shape us. They shape what we become, and they shape our whole world and history in absolutely profound ways. And we can't escape these ideas. Not before enlightenment. Yeah? Actually, we need ideas. We need myths to live by. We need a kind of framework with which to orientate ourselves and to interpret our experience and to make sense and to navigate and to orientate our life, as it were. Yeah? That's how we see. That's how we function in the world. Yeah, we can't not have these ideas. We actually need them. Yeah, but the Buddhist approach is to see that they are just ideas, that they are ways of looking and ways of interpreting, and to sort of see, to have insight into that's what we're doing, and that's how we create ourselves and our world. Yeah. In a way, that's the crucial, fundamental Buddhist insight, to see that that's what we're doing all the time. We're taking a particular way of seeing, a particular way of interpreting that creates us and our world. Yeah? So it's not really real in an ultimate sense. Yeah? It's shunyata, it's empty, to use the Buddhist terminology. It's mind-made. It doesn't exist separate from us in a kind of real, absolute way. Yeah. So yes, we can see that the secularized, materialistic worldview that we maybe have grown up with and that maybe can sort of seem self-evident to us, it can seem like it's absolutely true and real. Well, it's not really. It's just a particular way of looking, a particular way of conceptualizing. Yeah. It can feel very real, but that's just because we're in it. We're part of it. And it's hard to sort of see outside of it sometimes. Yeah. But yeah, Buddhism is saying it's just mind-made. It's just a particular interpretation of reality. Yeah. And then, of course, Buddhism says, well, this is the same true of Buddhist myths as well. Yeah. Buddhist myths, Buddhist cosmologies, they're also just ways of looking, just ways of interpreting. They also create a certain kind of world, a certain kind of self, as it were. Yeah. This is the extraordinary thing about Buddhism. This is the extraordinary, profound genius of Buddhism. That it's the religion that gets underneath religion. Yeah, it's the religion that sort of sees even itself is just a way of looking that creates a certain direction, orientation, a certain kind of experience of self and world, as it were. So if you study the history of Buddhism, if you study how Buddhist doctrine unfolded through the ages, you see this. You see that Buddhism is constantly self-critiquing itself. That it sort of settles down and starts to literalize a certain view, and then some teachers come along and they just throw that all out. And there's a kind of deeper understanding of how that's just mind-made, and you need to have a kind of deeper understanding, as it were. Buddhism is the religion that gets underneath religion. It's the religion that's constantly kind of going beyond itself. Yeah. So Buddhism, yes, sees that its own myths, its own mythologies, its own cosmology is also just a particular way of looking, just a particular way, a particular kind of conceptual, perceptual system, as it were. But this is not relativistic. This is obviously a very, very crucial, important point. It's not relativistic. Buddhism isn't saying, well, it's all just completely unreal, therefore it's got no meaning and no truth. Yeah, it's showing how our ways of looking, our ideas, our myths, our worldviews, they matter. Yeah, they absolutely crucially matter, because some of them create samsara, perpetuate samsara, and some of them maybe point towards nirvana. They orientate us in a way which can open up to some greater dimension of life and consciousness, as it were. So yes, I've been contrasting bringing the practices and the values and the ideas into our world, adapting Buddhism to the West, with putting ourselves into the Buddhist worldview, the Buddhist cosmology, the Buddhist mythology, as it were, in a way, sort of adapting ourselves to Buddhism. And I'm suggesting that maybe that's what we really need to do. Yeah. So next week I'll say more about how we might do that. What does that actually mean in practice? How do we put ourselves into those worldviews, those cosmologies, those myths, as it were? All I've said today is I've just talked in terms of taking things on faith, which is maybe a bit kind of bald and blunt. But next week we'll sort of explore much more what that means in practice. So we'll be talking about myth, we'll be talking about ritual, we'll be talking about the need for ideals, might even talk about nature and our relationship with nature and things like that, yeah? But we'll carry on the exploration more next week, yeah? And then we will eventually end up at Nirvana, yes? I'm aware that this is a course called What is Nirvana? And do we really want to get there? But I haven't said much about Nirvana yet, and I'm slightly worried that I'm going to get prosecuted under the Trades Description Act. But don't worry, we are going to Nirvana. We are on that journey there. It's just that I think, hopefully you can see what we're talking about at the moment is the do we really want to get there part of the question. But we are on a journey, and we will be exploring Nirvana at some point in the course.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you.